Good morning, everyone. My name is Lora Aroyo, and this is Welty, who will join me soon here for the second part of this talk. So today we're going to talk about truth. Thank you, Nick, for the great introduction. But this is not the truth that you might be preconditioned of thinking in any relation to fake news. This is the truth which relates to the practices with respect to how we describe digital media, how we interpret it, and how we model this knowledge further in order to deal with it in terms of machine intelligence. And before I continue with the rest of the talk, I would like to actually start from the end and make sure, so to kind of give the line of the talk with three key messages. The main premise of this talk is the fact that we have to really let go of the belief that there is one single truth, that there's somebody out there, an expert or another expert that actually knows what's right or wrong. There is no such single truth in the way, and here specifically we are referring to the way we interpret digital objects and describe them. However, there is a really large spectrum of opinions, perspectives, and lots of shades of gray. So most of the things are somewhere in between of the things we are certain about. And then the second message is another key premise in this talk is that we have been in the last decades very much focused in building the perfect software. But what we see right now is that software is really belongs somewhere into the past much more. And the data is really the central part of our processes. Without data, this software is nothing. And there are lots of examples around us which show really the central part and the crucial role of data science in order to advance businesses, to be creative, and to move along with your customers. And the last thing is really sort of an outlook into the future. How can we deal with this? How can we deal now with this new space which has multiple truths, lots of opinions? How can we deal with this large amount of data to be able to understand it better in those multiple contexts? And one of the things that we are proposing is to really look at this quantum cognition that we introduce in combination with our crowdsourcing approach, which allows us to gather this multitude of opinions in order to be able to actually sketch the whole spectrum of the truth. And let me start with an example. It's one of my favorite examples. This is the typical experience in almost every museum these days. Actually, it's getting worse and worse. The globalization makes the museums way too small for all the people that can travel. So this is the Louvre, Mona Lisa. That's as much as you can see on any given day if you go there and try to see. So it's zero experience. You see more people heads than actual picture. And this experience really limits, as I said, with the amount of people that visit museums. Then if you try to actually see what's going on online, can I see it online? Interesting thing is that I gave a version of this talk some years ago. Then the Louvre image of Mona Lisa was number 14 in Google image result. Right now, it's not even in the top 50. So you can actually not find it. And when I started searching and seeing why is it most of the time we are actually searching for art in digital form, it is very obscure. You find all the versions of it somewhere else, living out there on the web. And the actual original places, the holders of the content, the owners of those collections, their content is quite invisible. And mostly because of the fact that they are not described in the way that they can compete with the popularity of other versions of this content. And The other point is, in my experience, most museums are still extremely software-centric. They really are trying to find this perfect app that is going to draw everybody in the museum and give the perfect experience. But the way those apps are done, they're manually curated, very limited selection of some curator in the museum decides what is the most important thing to see in this museum for absolutely everybody, all the millions of people that come to the museum. So very little personalization, very static, very disconnected from the rest of the collection. And the last time the app in the Louvre was updated was 2015. So also probably quite outdated. So the Louvre has more than 300,000 artworks, and here you can see only pre-selected 2,000 artworks in the app. And this sort of obsession of finding the best app, providing user experience through app is actually, I think, is a drawback for museums because most of the people are not present in the creation of this app. What they are interested is not present. All the other Mona Lisas out there online and their variations created by the users are not present in the way these apps are built. And if you look at all these results I don't know whether these are the only factors but results in kind of drawback in the number of people that go into museum, even though it seems like more people ultimately are visiting. So the prediction was that by 2020 there will be about 12 million in the museum. However, last year there were only 8 million versus the peak in 2013, which were 9 million. And if you go again in the digital space, it is just a flourishing space of creativity. Completely unleashed because of the availability of digital material. And again, this is the example of the disconnect. This is not art which most curators will approve. This is art historically not interesting, possibly, or maybe can be called vandalism or anything like this. But this is also expression of what people are interested, how they interpret art, and what are the things they are interested. And this is the information, and this is the data about people that is not put neither in the apps, nor in the website, nor in the way the collections are described. And this kind of data is really essential in order to evolve your collection, in order to evolve the way it can be consumed, it can be presented and interacted with. And not one time off, but to actually have the data as the main driver behind all the processes, the main information in order to decide whether to build a new app or to change something in the app or to change something on the website. But it's not just collecting the data. It also to provide, to be open in order to understand the different perspectives, the different meanings, the different ways this data can be used, not to assume one standing point that for everybody, millions of users, those 2,300 paintings that are selected in the app are the most interesting ones. And there is a problem. Actually, I should say, but there is a problem. There's a problem because, as also Nick said in the beginning, we are in a comfort zone. It's very comfortable to actually know this is right, this is wrong, to place everything in two bins. And we have been doing this for as long as we can remember. In science, we train machines to understand what's right and what's wrong. We try to split the whole world in those two, in this binary state. And some time ago, Chris and I wrote this paper where we actually did analysis of specifically annotation practices for annotation practices that are very traditional for digital assets. And we found out what we call the 7 myths of human annotations. And many of those relate to the fact that we believe there is an expert which will give us the one single truth. If people disagree on something, something's wrong, this is bad, we have to make sure they only consider the thing that people agree on, so disagreement is not welcome. Lots of those practices are done really just once, never updated, so temporary aspect is very rarely present. And there is no evolution in this data. So, so this is the current state. This is the way we see or describe our digital assets. So to just exemplify it and sort of give you a sense of what I actually mean here, if you take an image, and in this case, we try to mimic a typical single expert task in this binary world. You have an image and you ask, does this image depict New Zealand? So most experts will say, well, this seems like a maps view of New Zealand. Yes, it is New Zealand. So what would you say about this image? Does it depict New Zealand? Depends on somebody's given definition. It might be New Zealand, it might not, but it does represent the country New Zealand. But here, we cannot reason about this. The task is yes or no. Does it depict or not? We cannot, there's nothing in between. So an expert might choose no, this is not depiction of a country. And how about this? Do you know, I guess most of you know this is a scene from Lord of the Rings. Is this New Zealand? Quite a lot of scenes are shot in New Zealand, but this is the fictional place in the movie, so is it New Zealand or not? Again, there is no gray zone here, yes or no. So that's how the annotation typically happens. But then we looked at this and said, well, in the real world, there is a lot of this, it depends. It depends what is the definition of New Zealand or what is the definition of the type of annotation that I want. And if we look at this sort of ways of harnessing disagreement, we started a crowdsourcing initiative approach where we, instead of forcing people into making these binary decisions, we try to harness their disagreement and really collect the whole spectrum of interpretation on every possible image, sentence, video, and so on. And that's what you get. If you actually give it to a crowd, not a single expert, but really crowd of lay users. In this case, everybody or most people, would be a common sense knowledge, but we've done this in medical domain, in much more specialized domains, and lay crowd, large amount of lay users not trained in a specific domain will actually cover most of the expert choices and will bring their own interpretation as well. And this is much more closer to reality. It's not yes or no. Yes, the first picture definitely much closer, of all the three, much more depicts New Zealand. The second one in some way, and the fourth one much less, and the third one much less. So we call this approach crowd truth. A crowdsourcing approach where really our goal is to try to gather the diversity of perspectives and opinions in the process of interpretation. And one of the side effects or outputs of this is that we can use this in order to extend expert vocabulary. In many experiments that we've done, actually we saw how expert vocabulary is really complementary to the crowd vocabulary. And this is very important because people use different words to search for things than the experts. And if we have both together and with some alignment, then lots of those missing images in search, in web search and so on, will not happen. And this will also create much more realistic, close to the real world picture for gold standard data sets for machine learning as well. So the key aspect of crowd truth is that it's a spatial representation. It's not a single point, data point anymore. It's not this yes or no, but now it's an entire vector of opinions which show the distribution of disagreement among them. And here to give you a sense of how the task is going. So we have this picture. Some tasks are really gathering the full spectrum of possible annotations, and others are voting. So this we gather here, and here we're voting on the spectrum that we gathered in the previous tasks. And as this, we create for every crowd annotator, for every image, we will get a vector. That's why it's a spatial representation with the votes of this person. And if we aggregate, if we give this image to be annotated by multiple crowd workers, something goes wrong with the animation. So we can aggregate all the annotators, and then we can get a vector which represents now the annotation for this image. And this, here you can see the representation of this being mostly voted being Gandor, a little bit of New Zealand, a little bit more outdoors, and so on. And if you look at the three images again, that's how they will be represented in the crowd truth space, which is now a very rich information. For every image, we have a lot of annotations with different weight, and each of those annotations actually can result in can be a cue for a search query for this image to appear in search results. And then this, because it's a vector space, it allows us to actually look at images and collection of images from many different perspectives. Look at them, evaluate them, interpret them, and so on. And we have developed a set of also metrics which allow you to measure quality when there is such a disagreement. Where typically in crowdsourcing, quality is measured only with the agreement part. Here we did the same. And here are a couple of examples. So we are working with video, annotating videos of different types in Tagasauris. We have annotated New York Times articles with emotions, and also applied it for some question analysis in Google Maps. And I'll hand over to Chris.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Chris Welty from Google Research. Just a word of caution, don't stare directly at the jacket. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and talk about something that's pretty new in these ideas that Lora and I have been investigating. So I'm going to backpedal and first just talk about some basic things here. Probability, the theory of probability, and the math that underlies probability theory. It's very pervasive in our community. Anyone who does anything with data science or artificial intelligence is using statistics quite heavily. And as most people know, it's based on a pretty simple notion derived from games of chance, largely, and this idea that you sort of count all the possible things that can happen, and then when you're concerned with one particular thing, such as rolling a 2 on a pair of 6-sided die, you just count the number of ways the thing you're interested in can happen, the number of possible things that can happen, and that's your probability, right? There's a 1 in 36 chance of rolling a 2 on a pair of six-sided die. There's a 2 in 36 chance of rolling a 3, and so on. But the most important and essential thing here is that the computers stay on. Oh, there we go. Is that the sum of everything that can possibly happen, all the probabilities of all the possible things that can happen, sum to 1, right? This underlies all the math that statistics is based on. So that's supposed to be obvious, and we use probability everywhere. We use it in polls, right? Gallup does polls all the time, continuously. They poll lots of things, but one of the things they're most famous for is sort of the approval rating of political figures. They do this constantly, and they'll survey 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 people, gather yes-no opinion surveys and things like that. And if 76% of the people approve of, let's say, Gore and 58% approve of Clinton, we interpret this, they interpret this, people interpret this as a probability. That if you meet a person on the street, there's a 58% chance they will approve. This was done, this particular one is famous, and we'll see why a bit later. This was in 1997. So you had a 76% chance of randomly meeting someone on the street and finding they approved of the work that Gore was doing. So we treat those things as probabilities. It's also, this practice is extremely common in artificial intelligence. So typical example, recognizing things in images, we give machines a bunch of labeled images, typically labeled by people. This is the kind of work that Lora was just talking about, and we say, here's a bunch of pictures that people say are of flowers. So machine go and try to figure out how to recognize flowers in images so that you can recognize them in images that we haven't had people already tell us what's in it. And the way these systems work, as you may know, is more or less based on theories of probability. So we extract some visual features of the image. The easiest visual features are colors, and we just associate probabilities with, when I see these features, I mean, it's not only colors, it's just the easiest to recognize and explain. And you get things like this. I'm really generalizing quite a bit here, but you get things like, if I see a lot of red and a lot of green in the picture because that's what was in the data that the machine looked at, then there's an 87% chance that I'm looking at a flower, right? If you look at these pictures, it seems about right. Most of these flower pictures have a lot of red and a lot of green. Maybe that was bad data selection, but you know, we have to live with that. If that means this flag is classified as a flower by the machine, that's the Bulgarian flag, by the way. I'm sure you all recognized it. Laura's Bulgarian. So that gets classified as a flower. Oh, well, that's a mistake. That's what 87% means. 13% chance of it not being that, right? So let's go back to this poll problem. So this was a famous poll, this one done in 1997. This one specifically, not because of the subjects, but rather because of an experiment that Gallup did with the order of questions that they were asking the survey respondents in this particular poll by request of a psychologist who we used to have referenced on this slide. Anyway, half of the people in the survey were asked the two approval questions about the president and the vice president. Half of them were asked first about Gore and second about Clinton, and the other half were asked first about Clinton and then about Gore. And if you're familiar with statistics, you know that statisticians who collect data like this always compute a p-value, a confidence value that tells you how good was your survey, how reliable was your sample, and what is the likelihood that those probabilities are correct. And so they sample until they get really good, high, super high confidence, like 1 in a million chance that those probabilities are inaccurate. And then all you do is change the order of the question, you get a huge difference. As far as statistical significance goes, this is gigantic, this is enormous. This did not make sense at all according to the underlying math for probabilities. There's no way to explain this. Of course, in the 20 years since then, people have come up with a lot of alternate kinds of explanations and ways to model this data, but they all seemed somewhat unsatisfactory. And of course, what this boils down to, what the math tells us in this case, is that in order for those things to be true, it means that people are simultaneously liking and not liking those two guys. In this case, let's take Clinton, for example. And obviously, you can't both like and not like. You either like them or you don't like them. Make up your mind. People don't believe in contradictions with themselves. People are just irrational. This is just ridiculous. And it turns out that 100 years ago, the world of physics was facing a similar kind of irrationality. You may have heard or be familiar with the famous double slit experiments, in which the controversy about whether quantum particles were particles or waves was being debated. And some experiments were done, and if you believed in the particle explanation, you believed that if you passed quantum particles like photons through a single slit, you would see some particular pattern of distribution on the other side of the slit. And if you passed those photons through a double slit instead of a single slit, you would see essentially the same pattern replicated twice, once behind each slit. But what was observed was wave-like patterns. So as you pass these two sets, as you pass photons or electrons through the double slits, they interfere with each other, and you get this pattern of distribution there. It's called an interference pattern. It's a signature, essentially, of a wave-like phenomenon. So, this seems to prove electrons are waves. And then somebody thought of adding, somebody who obviously didn't believe the wave explanation, decided to put a recorder at each slit and just count the photons or electrons as they pass through the slit. And the very act of doing that caused those particles to behave like particles again, and got that expected performance. This makes absolutely no sense, because it means that they're both waves and particles at the same time. How could that be? That makes no sense. Does that mean that reality is broken? Or does it mean that it's possible for there to be two things going on at exactly the same time that seem contradictory? This is called a superposition of states in the quantum mechanics world, and Schrödinger sort of developed this this way of understanding it, that if you have a cat inside a box that is exposed to some quantum process by which, if one thing happens, the cat will die, and if the other thing happens, the cat will be alive. And when you open the box, you will find that the cat is either dead or alive. But the important point of the Schrödinger cat experiment is to understand that while the box is closed, until you look, it is both dead and alive. It is in both states simultaneously, and this is what the double slit experiments prove. This idea of superposition is not a theoretical one, it's an actual one, that particles at the quantum level exhibit both behaviors until you look. And then when you look, it collapses into one or the other. But only at that moment. Until the moment when you look, it's both. It really is both. So was reality broken? Are people irrational because they can both like and not like Clinton at the same time? Or could it be that the math we've been using to try to explain these things is wrong? Wrong, not appropriate for this, for modeling this kind of data. And in the psychology community, they're actually starting to look at quantum math, not because they think that people are quantum processes and can pass through double slits, but because this math is actually more appropriate for explaining, for modeling what's going on here. I mean, if you think about this carefully, this should be fairly obvious. You can both like and not like Clinton at the same time. He was president. You may have disliked how he stood on trade. You may have liked his stance on the environment and foreign policy, disliked all the scandals he was involved in, liked what was going on with the economy. Which one do you choose? Is is even the last one such a simple yes-no question? Did you like his economic policies or not? There were a lot of them. He signed NAFTA. Did you like that or not? What aspect of NAFTA did you like or not? When you ask someone a yes-no question, you're essentially asking them to collapse something very complicated into a yes-no distinction. And so, of course it's possible that they could believe both at the same time. When you ask them the question, it collapses the way the Schrödinger cat experiment collapses. And the math that explains what's going on with quantum particles explains these choices better, because we're forcing someone, a person, to make a choice about something that's fairly complicated, and they make a yes-no decision at that time. And so that seems actually, when I describe it that way, a lot more analogous to the Schrödinger cat experiment than to a situation in which we posit at the beginning, it's possible to enumerate every possible thing that can happen. If you can do that, statistics is appropriate. If you can't, maybe it's not. So one of the very simple things that you can do here, before getting into the deeper math of quantum mechanics, which is complicated, is you can start looking at some of the consequences of taking a quantum view of this. And the first one is this: since we're talking about a situation where we believe I can't count every possible thing that can happen, then we have to break this very basic and simple assumption that everything sums to 1 in statistics. And in particular, this notion that the probability of something being true plus the probability of it being false has to sum to 1. That makes so much sense when you say it has to sum to 1. I mean, if I'm talking about a statement, if I'm talking about a fact, of course, it's either true or false, right? It's got to be right or wrong, right? Or did Lora just say that's not the case because there's perspective, there's reliability in sources, and so forth? What if we break this assumption that the probability of something being true and the probability of it being false, those probabilities do not combine to 1? What if we break this assumption? What does that mean? It means that we can account for the fact that there's some randomness happening when I collapse a complicated question, like approval ratings of political figures, or whether something is a flower or not. So we actually tried this experiment. Here's a picture, this first one. It looks like a Disney picture or something. It's drawn flowers. And when we ask a bunch of people to label all the images that they think depict flowers, we see that not everyone thought that was a flower. Why? Maybe because it was hand-drawn. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because there's butterflies, something else in it. The second one, there's a tiny little flower in there, difficult to see. Maybe that's why people didn't quite agree. And it's more prominently an egg. That one is maybe, if you don't, it looks like a heart at first glance. You have to know that that's a particular flower to recognize it as a flower. But the last two, very obviously flowers. Everyone seemed to agree. But if I ask the inverse question, right, this should be that not there. Which ones of these do not depict flowers? I should be seeing 1 minus these numbers here. If the probability of something being true and the probability of it being false sum to 1, I should be seeing almost exactly the opposite numbers. And for the very clear cases, I am. Okay, so for those two, nobody says it does not depict a flower. But for these others, I'm seeing something different. And in fact, if I look at the numbers side by side, I see that for these 3 cases, it's not even close. Statistically significantly different. Why? Well, there's ambiguity in here. There's questions about interpretation going on. People can believe that something is a flower and not a flower at the same time. And, I mean, does probability and statistics explain this? No. Those probabilities have to sum to 1. That must be sampling error. It must be because people are irrational. It must be because reality is broken. But it does make sense. If you use the right math, you just break this assumption, it's no problem. And so one of the takeaways is we have to start measuring this, because certainly in my community, which is AI, we assume the probability of something being true and false sums to 1 so much that we never even ask the not question. We never even ask, we just assume. Why would I measure that? I've measured this one. Why do I need to measure both? Because they don't sum to 1, and it tells you something. And so here, just to go back to this example, this is a nice example when we're starting to talk about superposition. I mean, this idea that this is Gondor, this is the city of Minas Tirith, to pronounce it properly. And we know, most of us know, this was filmed in New Zealand. So there is a sense in which this is New Zealand. There is a sense in which this is not, an imaginary sense, but nevertheless, that's a real sense. I mean, when we watch the movie, we don't really see New Zealand unless we happen to be looking for that. I want to go visit the place where they filmed that scene. Where is that? Now I'm starting to look at this as New Zealand. It's both. At the same time, it's both. Those are not contradictory. So when we view this as a superposition, we can actually do these experiments in which we see that kind of effect, the sort of effect that quantum math can explain, in which I ask people, what are the location tags you associate with this image, and then collect the negative. Which ones do you not associate with these images? And we see that they don't sum to 1, and we see where there's areas of confusion, and this helps us to identify those cases where there's a sort of valid superposition, of valid multiple ways of interpreting something. And this is good for images, videos, understanding text, understanding audio, which is extremely hard. I mean, understanding speech is almost at human, or maybe even beyond human quality now, but understanding sounds is really, really hard. Okay, and so just to wrap up, so Lora talked about this idea that there's no single notion of truth, and then we looked at it again from the perspective of quantum mechanics, and looking at it not just that there's multiple perspectives of truth, that there's this spectrum of ideas that may be represented there, but in fact that multiple seemingly contradictory things can be true simultaneously. And Lora also emphasized this idea that how data has become central. Data is the new orange. Right, and that common thing for people to focus on software and building apps, but rather that people should be focused on their data and how to understand their data, and that it really should be the central part of the enterprise. So we will stop there. Do we have one more?
And we do have a couple minutes. We're a little behind. We started off a few minutes late, but we do have a couple minutes for Q&A. We have a couple of microphones that we are going to pass around. Well, actually, our lovely assistants will be hovering over you as you answer your questions. Let me get things started, guys. I mean, this obviously hits really near and dear to kind of a lot of perception that I've kind of read into the world around me. And the lesson you speak to here is one that I think we kind of all see the benefit of embracing in terms of what's playing out now societally. I think a lot of us are frustrated with the way that, you know, a lot of polarities are defined in the media. You're in this camp or this camp. And I think we're kind of coming to realize how dangerous that line of thinking in a very literal kind of way can be. But the challenge is that people are really not trained to think this way. In fact, if you think about going to school and some of the earliest phases of our conditioning of our consciousness itself, it is to train us to bifurcate, to split, to sort of operate under the Boolean operator of or instead of and. And that gets very deeply baked into our psyches. And so obviously smart mathematicians and AI researchers, et cetera, can recognize these facts and come up with math that helps feed the algorithms more effectively. But if you extrapolate this notion that you guys speak to the larger arena of the world around us, and again, the problems that not looking at things this way I think can often cause, do you have any suggestions about how you get the populace, each of us, or frankly even people who might be more conditioned to think in bifurcated ways than your typical EMEA event attendee, any suggestions in how to kind of refine people's thinking to learn to see the world more in these terms?
Well, one you can say your view on this, but I think one thing which was really a big eye-opener was when we started doing the crowdsourcing task for crowd truth in the beginning, and we started with medical domain. It was just unbelievable to see how people who are not trained not trained in medical actually can have opinion there, which makes sense. But once you see it, it's so confrontational, and then afterwards it starts making sense. First is confrontational. How is it possible, especially if you're a medical expert? Why would you have studied for 10 years and then somebody comes and annotates some medical sentences and does it in some sense better than you? But it's not because those are bad experts. It's just that our background knowledge always kicks in. So we are not really looking at the things we're evaluating. We are trying to project what we know in order to decide exactly what you said. Is this right or wrong? Is this, does whatever, antibiotics treat typhus, for example, in any possible way, not whether it's in this sentence. So when you see this, I think doing crowdsourcing tasks like this can be really, can help. Doing them in reverse, nobody believes there is a difference. Once you see the result that there is, and it's not accidental, very often you can, when you look at the results, you can explain them. I think it's very good to start getting used to the idea of these multiple truths.
All right, and arms, please, so I can direct our microphone people. Any questions at all? Chris, in a professional realm with your colleagues, do you find a lot of resistance to this, or are people coming around?
I think it's always a kind of, yeah, because we are trained, and scientists are the worst at this, actually, that we actually believe we're after truth, and that there's going to be some ultimate one, and sort of getting people to see. I mean, I think there's a lot of movement in psychology to break this story that people are irrational. I remember the first one I heard was the idea of people being afraid of having their children kidnapped. I mean, the odds of that happening are astronomically small. It happens. But the odds of it happening are astronomically small. Odds of being killed in a car accident are way, 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 way higher. And we were calling that fear irrational. It's an irrational fear because it's not statistically motivated. And that just sounds ludicrous. Of course it's a rational fear. It's a rational fear because it's, it's a nightmare scenario. And that has to factor in. And I think you now see in a lot of work in psychology is telling a softer story now about how, yes, there are other factors that explain. It's not that people are irrational. People are just people. And this is a fact of how our brains and our bodies and this whole mishmash of things that happen in ourselves, this is how it works. It's not about statistics explaining it. It's about understanding how we work.
All right. Well, thank you guys kindly for joining us today, giving us a new perspective to take on. Now, I'm going to mention offhandedly quickly. Oh, sorry. Take the computer. Oh, we do have a question. And there's a mic. Great. Sorry. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Okay, great. So actually your last point about, well, we're just humans, and kind of as an explanation to this whole thing, it's just human of us to be the way we are. My question relates to this notion that if we look to this kind of crowdsourcing and multiple truths, and we all have an investment in what truth is, our investment in beliefs in ourselves and who the other people in the room are becomes pretty critical. And if we kind of have this belief that we are schematic and we're trained, or our cognition tells us to create a schema in early development, which I really like that you got to that point, that we're kind of in a conundrum, you know, as it were, that we are trained to think schematically, and yet we're saying those schemas are relative and you just have to experience it. How do you think our individual experience of that will translate when we look at a number? Numbers are so comforting. It's really nice to see like 47% that's likely to be New Zealand. We all kind of take comfort that there is this means by which we can cognate, and math makes sense. That's a really core value as humans, that we believe in this numerical system. So this abandonment of it, or this kind of other truth seeking, makes our belief, and again, I'll just reiterate this point, in each other's validation of truth, that I really believe that there can be this superposition of truth. And again, the EMEA audience is unique. How, if you could just speak one more time to how you think we will honor and respect this notion of truth, and how do you think the play for the interaction with this data sets, how do you get everybody interacting with it? What does that really look like? Is it a survey that we send out and say, do you think this or that? But what's the play on the cognition for long-term?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. This is a fairly new idea. In psychology, using this form of math is about 4 years old, and still pretty small community within the overall psychology community. In artificial intelligence, this is brand new. Not a lot of people are thinking about it there at all, and in data science in general. So I don't know how it's going to play out, but I think a lot of people sort of nod when they see it, and as you say, take comfort in the fact that, you know, it never really sat well with me to say that people are irrational because this statistical property isn't upheld by the data we collect from them. And so I think, you know, I think it has a good chance of being accepted, at least on the statistics, AI, science side. And it's also important to point out that there's kind of two things going on there. There's this superposition within a crowd idea, which is kind of what Lora was talking about. You have a range of perspectives. But really, I was focused on the individual there, and saying that actually you can get that spectrum within an individual as well, because when we survey, when we're directly accessing people's attitudes, interpretations of things, there is a complicated space that's being collapsed into something much simpler, and the process of doing that collapsing affects the data that we gather. So it's, you know, we can simulate that from the crowd, but we really are talking about that superposition being in each individual as well.